Across the Pacific in the United States, a furor is developing.
You, as an American teenager, are offended by statements from a group of foreign singers which strike at the very basis of our existence as God-fearing, patriotic citizens. Then we urge you to take your records, pictures, and souvenirs to the pickup points about to be named, and on the night of its appearance in Memphis.
The bond between you and me, it will be known forever. You showed me how to be free, stronger than me. You'll be known forever. I know without me or three, I hope to stay around for some time. But there's something pressuring me. I don't know how things will play out this time. The things you read in papers, where truth is merely capers with misleading headlines. A band as big as Jesus would only want to lead us to the light like a Lord. And there's something going on here, John. There's something going on here, John. There's something going on here, John. There's something going on here, John.
We have guests with us today, Victor Foster from the US here, and Roy Smith from the UK. So
Thank you
welcome,
for joining
guys.
us.
No, thank you for the invite. I appreciate it.
Oh, we love having you. Thank you very much for coming on and sharing your time with us and discussing our books.
Again, like I said before we started, I'm a huge fan, and I got down this rabbit hole, believe it or not, over 40 years ago. And when I was in 8th grade, the last day of music class, my music teacher did a slideshow on the Paul is Dead clues in 1983.
Wow.
And back then, you know, it was just, oh, this is interesting. It's an urban myth. Cool. And the Beatles are geniuses and everything else. Why aren't they marketing geniuses too? And what a great way to ensure that the next generation buys these albums over and over and over again and keeps the money train going. And up until, I'd say, the mid-2000s, I never really gave it a second thought. And then all of a sudden, I saw Paul McCartney in concert. Well, Billy now, as I call him, but I thought he was Paul in concert, and I realized live the voice wasn't even really close.
And he's playing different.
Yeah, and if you watch his mannerisms, how he holds the guitar,
how he stands,
all of it was different. And being the Beatle nut that I was, I readily picked it up, and then it got me thinking, and then I started researching and reading books, and then it's almost like a veil came off, because once you start questioning it and see, it really is obvious, especially the older he got, because you look at him today, I mean, to me, there is no resemblance between the original Paul McCartney and today, and I don't even think he makes too much of an effort to even sound like Paul McCartney anymore. He's out there doing what he wants to do. And, you know, if anything, I almost think that he's almost wishes that he could come out.
Well, he does come out and say it in his roundabout speaking, so that he's telling people without telling them.
Oh, yeah, he's pretty blatant about it. I mean, lyrics and songs, and the big one, the newest one that I stumbled upon and never even realized, I saw an interview with Ringo Starr, I guess, from the 70s, and he made a comment about the Long and Winding Road is not just a song, which got me, all right, now I'm doing the deep dives into lyrics. And you start reading, all right.
We could do a book just on that.
Exactly. Which led me into thinking, all right, let's look at other things, because I also believe that, again, because my aunt, who makes fun of me, says that how could anybody keep this a secret? It wasn't a secret. You look, anybody that was in the British music scene back in the 60s, they knew it because it was talked about. I mean, the two songs that pop into my head right now that I realized through research was Paul is Dead Clues, or Ruby Tuesday by the Rolling Stones, and Won't Be Fooled Again by The Who. I mean, it was out there. People just didn't want to talk about it, and there's a trail of dead bodies for anybody that did threaten to come out. So, I mean, that's how the secret's kept. I mean, I can think of 5 or 6 people that were probably killed because of the secret, including John Lennon, in my opinion, and probably the attempt on George Harrison's life in 1999.
Right.
So it's there. It's just a question of, do people want to accept it because he's such a icon. I mean, I give Billy his credit. Yeah, he's talented in his own right, but
I mean, I've already had some of my friends that they get pretty, they just don't want to talk about it because they don't want to hear that he couldn't be real. You know,
well, it'd be pretty, in the 60s, 70s, I guess it would have been devastating because he still was the sex symbol and women all over the world loved him.
Yeah, but there's women
today, would it be the same way?
Women our age are still the same way.
This is true. I saw him in 2017 and they were still throwing underwear on the stage at him.
Yeah, probably. So, yeah. So, Roy, you are a musician, so you can come into that aspect of his playing and whatever. But how did you, since Victor said how he came into it first through school, where did you first come into this?
I was in a studio, I think in the 80s, when somebody mentioned it to me. An engineer mentioned it to me. And I was very young, really, and so I didn't know quite what to make about it. And I thought, who knows the secret of the black magic box? We don't know. So then it somehow came up again a few years ago, and I started looking into it, and I really couldn't decide what was going on. And so I've seen so many things about it, but an enormous number of clues coming from the band and the band's camp themselves. So it's completely irrefutable that something major is going on with this, But what it is, I'm not absolutely sure whether, if you look, for example, at I'm the Greatest, the song by John Lennon, does everybody know that song?
Yep.
Oh, yeah.
And you look at the video, right at the beginning of the video I've seen, there's George Harrison, I think it was George Harrison, and then there are 2 babies that are supposed to look the same. Do you know what I mean? So there's this thing of 2, there's a beginning there somehow, which I don't think we've covered necessarily. So the beginning is the beginning of 2 lives, 2 beings that look very similar. And maybe one takes over from the other, who knows, So I think the thing is, and another George clue that's so clear is it's Johnny's birthday backwards. You've all heard that, presumably.
Yep.
And it's the backmasking. He's singing, and you could argue he's singing he never wore his shoes, we all know he was dead. But it's absolutely clear. It's completely irrefutable as far as I'm concerned. But the thing is, what does that mean? And I think the naysayers will say, well, he's mocking. Yeah, it's from The Crossing. It's from the album. But the naysayers would say he's mocking his audience. But I think it's more that the way that these things is that they have to show what's going on to some degree. On a personal level, I think George had an honesty about him, and I think he wanted to tell something about what had happened, So, over the years, I had a lot of, I really didn't know which way to go. Has this happened? Has it not happened? And I think that's what the whole thing relies on. It's duality all the time. Whenever Billy speaks, there's a duality to it. There's a kind of, does he mean this or does he mean that? That's the trick. That's why it's very hard to come to a conclusion. But eventually, you know, the tons of clues come bearing down on you, and then you think, well, there's obviously something going on.
Otherwise, why continue it? Why continue everyone in their solo careers and in their speaking and everything? Why would they continue to keep bringing this back?
Right.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's a kind of endless thing, isn't it? And as you were saying earlier, the lyrics are very interesting as well. If you look at Band on the Run, I think it's a really clear description of Billy's
The
position.
first one says to the second one there,
Oh,
I
there.
hope you're having fun.
Yep.
And stuck within these
That's-
four walls, stuck in this contract, you know.
Yeah.
Well, from what I understand, and correct me if I'm wrong, when this originally, this wasn't supposed to be a lifelong commitment. From what I've discovered, it was originally he was going to impersonate Paul for a few months till things calmed down. Then the Beatles were going to break up and it was going to be done. But then it morphed into what it morphed into for whatever
Right.
reason. But
Well,
that's
and
what-
who knows too, if the people that took Paul out didn't want it to die because it's their income. I mean, you got to remember the Beatles in the mid 60s were the British pound. I mean, Roy, you
Right.
maybe can attest to that. That was their a lot of their income. And at that same point, I'm trying to think, they took Brian out.
So they took Brian out, David, their lawyers, David Jacobs.
But I mean,
Jake
Brian
Asher
was like
Stock,
great.
I mean, the list
Brian
goes
was
on.
great within 9 months. And if that was what the original plan was, now we're taking Brian out and now they're at a loss and they have to go on.
But-
And from then on is when Billy actually took control of the band and started, being bossy.
My question, the one I could never understand was Mal Evans. As close as he was to the original foursome, how did he just not miss a beat and attach himself to Billy?
I don't think he had a choice.
You think so?
Look,
He's with him in Kenya, supposedly.
When they took out Paul, they basically said, we can take any one of you out, we can replace you, and no one's going to be all the wiser. I mean, that basically is the threat to everyone who wants to speak. That's in the know. We speak.
Thoughts about what you were saying a few minutes ago as well. You know, the idea of it maybe being proposed as a temporary thing and then becoming a long-term thing. You know, what better way, as we've seen with the pandemic and everything, what better way to make something, to introduce something than to say, oh, it's only temporary, but not intending it to be temporary anyway.
At all.
You know,
Right.
You know, lockdowns were intended to be something like 2 weeks long, you know, became 2 years. So you know what I mean?
Uh-huh.
Right. And what you were talking about with George Harrison and the clues, I mean, the duality thing goes back further even than that. If you look at the Yellow Submarine album cover and movie, you've got the two Pauls popping up in there, you know, with that duality thing. And what people don't realize is the George Harrison, Paul McCartney relationship went back a lot further than what people think. They knew each other long before Paul ever met John.
Right.
And from what I've read, they were closer friends as kids than was ever really came out. So, I mean, if this it rocked George's world, because if you look at his interviews, he, for years, 1966, something catastrophic happened. He would never say what, but I mean, his whole attitude changed, and so did John Lennon's for that matter. I mean, you look at them, that 4-month period from September 66 to 67. I mean, George, their attitudes, their personalities all changed. They did a 180. I mean, do I think John Lennon would have been a heroin addict if Paul didn't get killed? No, I don't. I think Yoko Ono was a handler. She was involved somehow in this. I mean, you look at her actions through the years. There was more than that than a marriage. I mean, there's a story there that needs to come out.
There is a story there. I don't want to touch that one at all.
Well, to talk about George's and Paul's relationship, you're right, Victor. It did go back, way before they met John. I think about the age of 13 is when they met on the bus. But I have an interview with George in a magazine where he says that, Paul is the center of the Beatles.
Mhm.
He's the one that kept the Beatles together. He's the one that was able to smooth over their differences. That's why they don't argue very much. And when there is an argument, Paul steps in and he, negotiates. He does his diplomatic thing. So absolutely. And George credits Paul with creating the Beatles sound also. And George, says that he was an awesome musician, and he had the most talent out of them. So yeah, George, that relationship, they were very, very close, like brothers. All four of them, obviously. And Ringo also says, the guys are like brothers to him. And John even stated that Paul, talking about Paul was like bearing his soul. So you had that you got, that they're very close brothers, in the band, the Beatles. I think that was a lot of their attraction too. It's just
It
seeing that
was, yeah.
difference.
Yeah.
They all
Like-
shared to some extent the same
Mind melt.
mind, but yeah, I mean, you go through that Hamburg experience they had. I mean, they were probably closer than brothers.
Look at even on the stage where Paul messes up "I'm Down" and he's in the second verse and he doesn't know where he is, and then Ringo just automatically gets him out of it because
Yeah.
he knew what was going on. They worked synergistically together to be able to bring that. Yeah.
Yeah, I often wonder what could have been, if none of this would have ever happened. Because, I mean, going back to old interviews, I stumbled upon a John Lennon interview, I think it was 1963 or 4, where he was saying that even if the Beatles broke up, in his mind, him and Paul was still right together. The Beatles were, John and Paul's relationship was one thing, the Beatles were another. The Beatles could break up, but John and Paul were going to be together. And
Yeah.
I mean, you don't do the change that went through like that for no reason. So I mean, it's
Yeah.
on one hand, it's
Paul's
actually terrifying.
personality doesn't change that fast to make that reason.
No.
Yeah.
But again, personality-wise, Paul to Billy in 4 months. I mean, you don't physically change like that. The personality changes, the way he dressed, cared, everything. I mean, it's out there. You just got to take the blinders off and be willing to accept it. And the world 50 years later still really isn't ready, I don't think. But again, legally, can you do it? I mean, Billy's got kids now, and they carry the McCartney name. What happens to them, if all this comes out, and, what kind of legal ramifications are there? I mean,
That's the big
Billy
question.
himself is stuck in a spot right now, and I don't think he's too happy about it, because especially in the last few albums, I guess from Memory Almost Full up to now, there's lyrics in there where he drops clues that he's not happy with the way things are. But again, I don't feel too sorry for him either. I mean, I had his money.
Since he is the richest rocker out there, so.
Going back to your book,
But he should be noted. He should be recognized for his works, and we know Paul left many unfinished pieces that he would have been working on. So we can imagine which ones were written by Paul and not Billy. But it'd be great to see their work separated and possibly Paul children get some of their due because it's their father versus Billy's children.
Right. I think there's 2 of them out there that pretty much common knowledge that Paul had. 3.
3 that
Possibly.
Yeah.
But the question I have,
Yeah.
going back to your books, because I've never found this anywhere. You allude a little bit to Billy, for lack of a better way to phrase it, is being downright evil. And now.
Oh, just wait. It gets worse.
Well, that's my question.
Book
Is
number
that
3.
addressed a little bit
Book
more in
number
the
3, he
nonfiction
gets
book?
a lashing.
because I just wonder, you know, it just, you hear all the stuff about what a great guy he is, and then, you know,
That's him being.
is anybody that great of an actor, you know, to carry it around that, you know, especially, you know, you hear that great marriage that him and Linda had. You know, we only spent 9 months apart when he was in jail in Tokyo in 1980, and, you know, she never had a bad thing to say about him. But then I've read some things out there where he had that typical Liverpool English attitude toward women, where, you know, women were kept in their place. That goes totally against everything that's come out in 50 years about him. So, I mean, you know, if he's truly that good of an actor, you know what? I mean, I don't know. That's the one thing that makes me question, though, because there's never really been a chink in his armor anywhere except for what he on purpose shows you. And, you know, you would think somewhere in the line there'd be a slip up somewhere.
No, there are
There's
some
none that I can find.
Gotta
though.
just find them. There's tapes that were done that Linda did with someone that Billy was very upset with her doing these tapes and airing their personal problems, issues, whatever it was going on. And he actually had to end up buying those tapes. So nobody's ever heard them.
Oh, I've never heard about that.
Then there's also Heather Mills comments too, and what happened with her. So
that's what's cemented.
Why would she need him to protect her? Because this is huge.
Yeah, that interview where she gave there on Britain's version of Good Morning America, where she came out with all that the world's not ready for whatever happened.
I think
that was the thing right there where the last domino fell for me. All right, she's not. That's it. Something's going on, and you know.
What were they saying in Britain, Roy, at the time when that all happened? I mean,
they were just doing a job on Heather Mills, just trashing her so that nobody would listen to her at all. You know, a bit like they did with Donald Trump. You know, very successfully manipulating people into just thinking that whatever she said was trash and don't bother listening to it. It was quite sad because she seems quite a nice woman to me. You know, but yeah, she was very clear. It's just amazing to me that people can say things publicly and nobody really hears what's being said. You know, I saw an interview with somebody who was reporting satanic ritual abuse, and the interviewer had a T-shirt on saying "hoax" on it. You know.
Oh, geez.
I mean, so
yeah, I've heard several of those ladies.
Really clear signals about things, and Heather, what she said was very clear. You know, people, their minds would be blown if they discovered the truth. You know, they wouldn't be able to believe it.
Yeah, the SAR is a big thing as far as that aspect.
Yeah, I think
SRA. I'm sorry.
Yeah, SRA. Yeah, all interlinked, but suffice to say that things are shown to us, you know, hidden in plain sight is a big part of the, you know, the way that things are done, you know.
That's the key thing, what you just said right there, Roy, and I've told it over and over again to my aunt. What better way to hide something than don't hide it? It's in plain sight.
It's in plain sight.
Because people don't look for it.
So you guys had brought up the backmasking before, and you've worked with engineers, Roy, in the studio. That's not something that just happens to come out clear as a bell, flipping it around and playing something backwards, right?
No, I mean, you know, people could argue that, but I think the example that I've given with George is so clear that, you know, there's no doubt about the fact that he switched the tape over and sang it and then switched the tape back again. And I think sometimes it's done like this. I mean, I've done some of them myself, you know, number 9. I've done, and it does come out as Turn Me On, Dead Man. The other thing is that John, you know, I mean, this came from Aleister Crowley, didn't it? He said, listen to music backwards, walk backwards, do backwards. And John, I heard an interview with John where he said that when he's in a car and he's passing and he sees a sign for a town, he says it backwards, which is audibly different to just switching the letters back. You know what I mean?
Right.
It's like, you know,
It's
We would-
gibberish if it's just switching the letters back, you know.
Yeah, it's a completely different thing, because audibly you can't. It's very, very difficult to know what something would sound like backwards. You know, you could change, like, my name is Roy. You could change. You could say backwards, it's your. But audibly, it probably isn't. It's something different, and especially as you've got more syllables. You know, and somebody told me one about Omicron. You know, if you switch it backwards audibly, which is very easy to do in any studio these days, it comes out as lock him up. You know, and it does.
Yeah.
You know,
Ann and I've had some playing around with that. I have an app. I'm looking to see where it's at. I have an app that's reverse speech. I gotta find it. Go ahead, you guys can. I'll look.
I don't know if I finished. Did I say? So John used to practice when he was in the car. He used to sort of practice saying things backwards as he used to pass different signposts, which is kind of a really interesting thing to do, I think. So to me, it shows that he was very interested in occultic practices. You know.
I can't find my app, but there's an app out there. I think it's called Reverse Speech.
Yeah.
And Ann and I, when
Find
we were together, gosh, Ann, that's almost 2 years ago
2
already.
years ago. Yeah.
We were playing around with reading chapters out of our book and seeing what would come up in reverse speech as we could hear audibly. And there were a couple things that did come up, but I mean, it's just because that word, when you flip it around, that's what it sounds like.
Yeah.
But for them to put a phrase and those kinds of words in there, that had to been done in the studio. And I believe one of the engineers did have that question asked of him and said that was it takes time and it's purposeful.
Yeah.
Well, you listen to like Rain, where they just play the song backwards, and you listen to the backmasking like Roy's talking about. It's
Two different things.
two different things. John's backwards track on Rain, for me anyway, it's unintelligible. You know, but you know, when they're doing it on purpose, you can hear clear as day the words. And Billy's been doing it too. I mean, that DVD I had, The Space Within Us All, had the bonus tracks on if you put a code in there. And one of the videos on there was him in a sound check singing a whole song backwards.
Oh,
I can't remember the name of it, but it's out there. You can find it.
Wow.
But the chorus was about Linda, but the main lyrics, he was singing backwards the entire song. And so, I mean, it's in there. And there's songs on his albums now, like the one I was listening to the other day. I forget what song it was, or album for that matter, because I'm trying to think about it. But you play it backwards and he sings clear as day, I Was Willie Campbell.
Yes.
Yeah.
I just heard that one not too long ago too.
Yeah, so I mean, I think
Campbell.
all the Beatles were into that stuff to one extent or another. And I know the occult interested them, because I've read stories and stuff about that too, where they were all interested in it.
But why would they be wouldn't they be interested in it? Because now Paul's on the other side.
Exactly. You know,
That they're trying to communicate.
right.
I mean, you know, I get that.
And it would be the only way to get the truth out too,
Yeah.
in a very clever way, and also kind of pointing the finger as to.
I mean, they were
whoever
quite.
did it, you know.
I think they were quite spiritual, though, weren't they? I mean,
Mhm.
you know, if you take
Yeah.
you know, people keep saying the literal meaning of the word occult is, which is hidden, that can relate to spiritual things, both good and bad. And, you know, I think they were hungry to understand how the universe worked and how spiritual growth occurs, you know. And even John's song, The Word, was about that. You know, it was about understanding that the highest frequency is the frequency of love.
Right.
Right.
Love opens the doors for all sorts of things, you know.
But since we're already aware,
I mean, that's
one of the things they've been talking about is the fact that they were changing the frequencies, and that might have been one of the issues that Paul was having, was knowing that they were, because they did become aware and learned how the engineering worked and whatever, how that was being played out.
And the question is, if Paul wasn't the original Paul, as interested in all that stuff as he was and getting involved with it all, and would have just let George Martin produce everything, would any of this have come out? Would it, you know,
Would he still be here? Who knows?
Yeah, because and again, you probably know more than me, but I've heard that back before the replacement, that the original Paul was kind of like John. He wasn't the perfectionist. He was more like with John, all right, we've done it, it's good enough, put it out, we're good, move on to the next thing, you know. So if that's the case, how did he get made aware of this? Unless, you know, was it accidental? Did he stumble upon something? Or, you know, did he see something going on in the studio? And, you know, again, I think all four of the Beatles are geniuses on one level or another. Especially John and Paul, and George too. I think George, I hate to say this because it's a Paul discussion, but George was severely underrated, especially with his music in the 70s and 80s. You know, he was a great songwriter in himself. He just bloomed a little later. But I mean, you get three geniuses like that, how do you hide something from them? You know, even if they're not looking.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I think that just being at genius level, and I agree, I think they all were, that the inquisitiveness of wanting to know would have been a driving force. And I'm sure they had to, they were checking those soundboards and doing whatever they needed to do to tweak things to make, I mean, look what Paul did with the backwards tape loops, you know, for Tomorrow Never Knows. That was just from messing around.
Right. And he gets no credit for being, I mean, he was avant-garde before avant-garde came around. It was a thing, but no one knows of it because, you know,
right,
history's been rewritten. I mean, John and George are gone. Ringo doesn't talk. And to finish the famous saying, Paul's rewriting Billy being history. Paul, constantly rewriting history. I mean,
yeah. And it's not lack of memory, because there's nothing wrong with his mind when it comes to other things. So
he just doesn't know.
Memory because they're not his memories.
Right. I mean, it's obvious. You catch him in interviews sometimes, and you could see this stumped look on his face, like, oh boy, and then he just makes something up. And anybody, you know, but he covers it up well, and then the interviewer doesn't ever follow through with it all. I mean, then that makes me wonder too, because there's been some blatant faux pas out there in interviews that have just gone by the wayside. That
they're not faux pas. I think they're set up because that's the way of telling. The David Letterman interview, that was set up.
The one where he said, "This is I am the double," or "This is me."
Yeah. He is me. I am him, or whatever he said. Yeah, I think that whole set was something happened that week, and he went on there, and they dropped that.
That's when that fake Ringo interview came out, where supposedly, if you remember, I think it was 2014. This happened.
April Fool's Day.
Yeah.
That's one way of being able to tell the truth. Oh,
right.
It was April Fool's.
Ringo admitted it all, and then it was just a couple days later that Paul was on David Letterman, or Billy was on David Letterman, and you can't find that April Fool's joke anywhere on the internet anymore. I know, as I was looking, but if it's fake, why take it down and hide it? Right. But that's what they've done.
Well, actually, that David Letterman interview came out when the Italia Wire report came out.
Was that it?
Yeah, that was in 2009. That report came out, the forensic report.
Yeah.
Came out. And then a few days later, he went on David Letterman, and they were talking about the rumor because they're trying to suppress that information coming out.
Yeah.
And it's hard to find that report on the internet anymore.
And what's sad is back when it first came out, I printed it for some reason.
I have part of it in my computer. That's
can't
why we
find it anywhere anymore.
Pictures.
You keep it. It's a treasure.
Yeah.
Very interesting.
Whenever you guys, anybody that's listening to us, whenever you find something, download it to your computer. If there's a YouTube out there with something, download it, because you need to have it saved as something on your computer so it doesn't go away. Because they're taking things down all the time. Yeah.
One thing that I had was on John Lennon's death. There was a website I went to and found some information about John, and they had a picture of the lobby door with the 3 bullet shots through the glass and the blood splatter on the glass. And that website's long gone. So please
Speaking of
download
John
anything,
Lennon.
keep it on John Lennon.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Have any of you heard supposedly there was a deathbed confession out there on just recently about a guy saying that he was the second shooter at the Dakota building? That I heard that somewhere, and I've been all over the internet trying to find it, and there's nothing out there for it. This was just a couple months ago. I heard about it, and this guy was dying of cancer of all things, and he supposedly admitted that he was the second shooter.
The second shooter was the shooter. The second shooter was the person who actually,
Did all the shots?
No, I'm not all the shots, but I was probably the kill shots.
Oh yeah, I agree with that. I mean, do you think Mark David Chapman fired anything?
He fired. He just didn't. Whatever. Yeah. And
Well, he
Yeah,
said
but bottom line, you do believe there was more than one shooter.
I believe it.
yeah.
And I believe it came from the elevator door, the service door,
Which
Yeah,
is
I read that
opposite
too.
the
Just to the
entrance
corner.
doors.
from the lobby door. And I think that's where he was, because it's perfect, because it's dark there, you can't see, and it's an easy escape right to
Yeah,
the
you can
parking
bop
garage.
yourself out of the door and be right there and back into the garage and out you go.
Right.
And I also think that the guard was part of it. He knew what was going on, and he kind of set it up that way.
Have you read the second book?
I have, yeah.
Yeah, because we get in for everybody this book right here, which Anne has behind her, the blue one, is our second book, and that one we do a deep dive into John's assassination, what Mark David Chapman was doing prior to his going to New York, and he went twice. What was his salary, Anne? $4 and some odd cents, and he's traveling all over. He's doing, and yeah.
Yeah. And he was working at the hospital in the copy room, I think it was, where he was a patient. He was a mental patient there too. So, and that was in Hawaii.
Right.
But he has connections to the military, U.S. military, and he was over in Beirut for a while.
Well, he was part of that. I want to say Peace Corps, but it wasn't the Peace Corps. It was the other group. There's several groups that were indoctrinating.
Yeah, he went to the YMCA.
YMCA.
Yeah. And then right before he shot John Lennon, he went to Georgia and visited a friend of his who was a sheriff, and the sheriff is the one that gave Chapman the bullets to kill John Lennon.
That town is about 10 miles from where I sit right now.
Really?
Yep. Yeah, I read that and was shocked. I did not realize he was from Georgia down here.
He's not from there, but he made friends with the sheriff from down there when he was
I thought
part
he
of
went to
that
high school
YMCA.
down here too or something.
There was some kind of
College.
what?
I heard he went to college there.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
in
There was
Georgia.
a very strange thing about the autopsy. There was an autopsy photo shown in the UK. I think it might have been the Sun newspaper, and it was John Lennon's body, on horizontally on the thing, and it looks like he's wearing a mask. It's a really strange picture. You just see this line kind of like this. It's like somebody's put this kind of rubber mask on him or something, and I don't know what that picture's all about. It's really strange, but it's very peculiar that not many people talk about that at all. I mean, it's another thing that's completely in your face, but nobody sort of says, "Oh, look at that. That looks really strange."
Yeah, I don't think I've ever seen that picture.
What that's about. I don't know if it's, trying to create a narrative, trying to make people think something, whether it was a false picture entirely, whether it's something going on with John not being John at that time, at that moment, I don't know.
Well,
It's
not
really-
knowing exactly what bullets did to his body, it might be also a way of covering some things up, but we've never heard reports of that, so that
Well,
doesn't
the
make
thing-
sense.
I'll send you the picture and you'll see what I mean, because I think you
Yeah.
can still find it. It was published in newspaper, but it's the only picture I've seen. And it does look very, very odd. And you have to question who's created this picture. Is it created? Is it a real picture? And what is
When
it doing?
did it come out? Back in 1980, or did it come out after?
Do you know, I think it was about, I think it was at the time, but I'd have to check. But I'm pretty certain it was at, you know, at the
That'd
time.
be interesting. Put it up in our Facebook group. So anybody wants to go over to our Facebook group, The Shadow of a Bass Band on Facebook. We have a lively discussion over there. These gentlemen are with us there. Yeah, that'd be interesting. I'd like to see it.
The question is, and I know you touched on it in the second book, you know, that, and you've alluded that John was getting ready to come out with the whole truth right before he was killed. Was he though? You know, was he right? Because I've read that he was making plans to go back to England in 1981, and for whatever reasons, I'm just, what could he possibly have done to merit being killed other than he was going to let the truth come out after all those years? But what would have, what could have happened in 1980 to make him decide, all right, I've had enough now, I'm going to tell the world? Because if he did make that decision, he had to know his life was going to be in danger. And to get out of that limo the way he did in front of the building instead of going in the garage like he normally did, I mean, why would he have done that?
He didn't have a choice.
I mean, he couldn't just,
His car wasn't allowed to go into the entrance.
Okay.
Mhm.
There
Yeah,
again,
no,
the
his
security
car-
guard that Ann alluded to would not allow it. So
Right.
So basically, they set up a kill zone like basically they did with Kennedy
Correct.
in Dallas.
Right. Right. And don't forget, his bodyguards were called off that day too.
Yeah, that was my next thing. There were no bodyguards there. He always had
Yeah.
bodyguards. Where were
Yeah,
they?
and they were in plain clothes, and you never knew where they were, when they were around, you know, so fans never knew. But he had bodyguards. It just didn't look like he had bodyguards, but he had them. And that night, for whatever reason, they were called off. He didn't have any bodyguards. So, and then that's what they did to Kennedy too.
Right.
right.
Again, I know you said you didn't want to open that can of worms, but again, I personally think Yoko had a hand in everything. That's just me and my.
We can have our own personal opinions. I agree. I think the same thing. She had her hand in it. But
I think she knew what was going down.
I mean, obviously that's why we didn't bring her into the books, other than just the night that John met her when we believe Paul was killed, because we just didn't want to go there.
Well, and also in order to continue the series, can you really
Right.
see Yoko Ono raising Paul McCartney's son?
Son.
No.
Yeah.
It had to be somebody else.
Oh, I really. If
There's that
Paul
too.
Lived, I don't think he ever would have had a relationship with Yoko Ono to begin with. Again, because like I said, I think that was a setup, and she was a handler. So you know, if A didn't happen, B never would have happened, and how would history have changed anyway? Which you guys did in the books. So I mean,
Well,
so
and
you did
and
it for
you look
one
at-
reason, but it works too.
look at the fact too that how did she end up getting into John's circle? Through Billy.
Yeah.
Well, people don't realize that. People don't realize that he knew her first.
He knew her
You know,
first.
Yeah.
He let her into his house.
Right, and you know, even I didn't know
Which
that. For the
house
longest
is it? We
time.
aren't quite sure, but he let her into his house.
Mhm. Yeah, before he moved to Cavendish, and Cavendish at that time was under construction. So he was
yeah,
lying.
it would have been Billy. We believe it's Billy that she actually met with.
Mhm.
Billy now, as Paul is trying to say, it was him, obviously, and he was just dissuading her to go towards John. But we don't know. What were they talking about prior to?
Don't know. That's no one. That's the question.
It was interesting what May Pang said about when
love to talk to
John
her.
went for a meeting, when he was still with May Pang, and he went back to a meeting with Yoko, and then he came back from his meeting from Yoko, and he seemed almost like he was hypnotized, you know.
He was.
He was, yeah. They said they hypnotized him to quit smoking.
They hypnotized him. He went there so he could be hypnotized to stop smoking. Well, why did he
Right.
have to go to Yoko's house to be hypnotized to stop smoking?
Yeah.
And he had no intentions of staying there. And then all of a sudden he's like, sorry, May, I'm
So-
going back to Yoko. I mean, that was a whole.
I think there was another thing as well. I mean, they lived in the Dakota, which was the setting for the film Rosemary's Baby.
Baby. Mhm.
And the old satanic
Ugh.
couple gave this young hobo woman who lived there also a kind of pendant that stank of some sort of weird herb. And then the next thing, she was dead. She was squashed on the pavement, having fallen from the building. And apparently, I'm sure I heard May Pang say or read her saying that Yoko gave her the same sort of pendant that stank of this kind of strange magical herb, you know, the herb of ill intent, perhaps.
Yeah. Not surprised.
Yeah.
I'm not saying anything further, but I'm not surprised.
Well, if you play one of her songs backwards, I forgot which one it was, but there's a backward, masking clue that says
I was
I'm a witch.
breaking up. We're going off.
Oh. Yoko, and one of her songs, and I forgot which one it was that she sang, but if you play it backwards, she says, I am a witch.
Oh,
There you go.
There you
I'm
go.
sure.
She told on herself, as they have to do.
yeah.
Bad karma not to do that.
Wish I remember what song that was. I forgot, but it's out. It was out there for a while.
I'm sure you could probably Google it and it'll probably pop up. Maybe.
Interesting choice, the Dakota. I mean, has he ever spoken about why he chose to move to the Dakota building, especially with this kind of satanic connection to the film? You know.
I don't know. I haven't heard anything why he chose.
It was at her idea to move there because they had a place down in Soho, I think, prior to.
Oh.
That's where he saw the UFO, wasn't it? Down in Soho.
In London, Soho, London.
No. We have in New York City, down by where the towers used to be, Greenwich Village, and that area.
Mm.
They had a flat down there.
Oh, right. Okay. Yeah.
And I believe that's where he saw the UFO that has been documented that I forget, I think it was Julian just even said something recently about his dad telling him about that.
I know nothing about
It was
that.
like right there. It was like he was out the window or on a balcony and was just like right there.
And we write about that in our book too.
Yeah. So everybody just thinks that we just throw this stuff in there. No, if you take something in our book and you aren't sure if it's fact or fiction, Google it.
Yeah.
Or just write us.
or just write. Yeah, or just ask.
Join our Facebook group and ask.
But most of this stuff we
But I
have,
think
we
Google
have it
is
in there
being
for a
increasingly
reason.
controlled, isn't it?
What?
Sorry? It broke up, Roy.
Oh,
Sorry.
I mean, my impression, my feeling when I use Google is that it's increasingly controlled and increasingly censored.
I'm sorry.
Things that I look for are
There's
much
probably
harder.
other search engines people can use, but I just use that as just a way of throwing it out
Yeah.
there to research and look it up on
it's an
any
interesting
source,
point.
through any means,
Yeah.
whatever.
Yeah, but I find it interesting that that's happening. It's not just a case of look for another search engine. I think it's interesting that this is happening because we're right in the throes of this new world order being played out.
Right.
And so we're being increasingly manipulated and, with propaganda and with censorship. Censorship is becoming a massive problem increasingly, I think, almost like weekly. And I think it's all relating to, I think this whole this whole subject is related to, the secret, organizations that exist that run the music industry and have run Hollywood for decades and decades, So I think it's sort of coming to a head. It's getting more and more intense at the moment,
Yes. And more is coming out, more conspiracies and things, and what's really going on.
They bear down on us,
Yeah, and a lot of people were finding a lot of the conspiracies that they think are conspiracies are truths. And it's just the word to discredit the truth. And as a result, more and more is being revealed. So we just want more and more revealed on this topic. But I think there's dominoes that have to fall. And then it's just going to be, flowers going to just open, and it's just going to all.
Well, I think Billy has to pass first, really, before anything happens.
I agree.
And even then, I question how much, again, because of he's got his kids to think about.
It depends on who's going to come out. So, I mean, as we've all just been discussing, there's a lot of people that have been in the know from the beginning, as well as have come out later on that they know. So, it'll all come out.
Yes, it will. You can't keep some secret forever, but.
No, I think once he passes, that more people will be open to be able to discuss it.
The question I have also, are his kids aware that they're not really of the McCartney lineage? Or is this all going to be a shock to them?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think Linda knew. I mean, I watched the podcast you guys did about a while back, what did Linda know? I mean, she knew what was going on before she ever met him. I mean, she knew he was,
correct.
That was so. I mean, she knew, but I mean, did they tell the kids?
Well, the one interview that sort of strikes me about that is Mary talking about. I think it was Mary. Billy was saying something about her saying something like, "Daddy, are you Paul McCartney?" Like questioning who he is. Well, wouldn't you already know that he's Paul McCartney? Whether he's famous or not, that's his name.
I remember that. He played it off like she was asking.
He played it off
Paul
like,
McCartney,
I'm just Daddy.
Paul McCartney, yeah.
Yeah. Well, he plays that off a lot, doesn't he? Where he sits there and says, I played him again. Look at him getting his hair cut, that type of a thing.
I mean, he actually said Paul McCartney is a character he plays.
The what?
He gave that one interview where he came right out and said that Paul McCartney is a character he plays.
Yeah. Yeah.
And, I mean, he came right there and said it, but no one in the public.
He has to say it. He has to say it for his own conscious
peace of mind.
Peace of mind, maybe. Thinking the karma's not going to get thrown back in his face someday. Wait until he gets on that wheel.
I think maybe for his own karma, he has to actually, constantly, and he probably wants to. I think he feels a strong affinity with Paul as well in some strange way. But one of my favorite interviews of him saying this sort of thing was the one where he's with Wings and Jimmy McCulloch, who I didn't know much about before, but I think he's a wonderful guitar player, and he was definitely his own man. I don't think he's the sort of person that would keep a secret very easily.
But he also passed.
Yeah, well, he passed.
I never thought of that. With him dying when he did, was that part of that whole thing too? Did he possibly find out that Paul wasn't Paul? And like as Roy said, I don't think Jimmy McCulloch, he didn't take crap from anybody. He spoke his mind and let the cards fall where they fell. Could he have found out, and then that's why he was killed, or if he was killed?
I mean, that's my feeling about it, because I mean, as far as I can tell, his sister, I think it was his sister, believes that he was murdered, and I think the guy that did the inquest said it looked like somebody was present in the room when he died. Whereas the official story is that he was alone and he did a drugs overdose and he died, But there was something strange about the lock. It had been broken or something like this,
That's
so it's
how
a
they
very
all die. The whole of the 27 Club, it's all car accidents and overdoses.
Yeah.
And that's just not. So they're not overdoses. Whatever.
No,
And that-
you can't have that many people go and call it a coincidence. I mean, there's, again, I don't know what's going on, but like Roy said, there's something
Well, how many
something
people
going
were
on in the music
age
in Hollywood.
27?
Yeah. I've read the theories where they're selling their souls to Satan, and 27 is the time when the contract's up, and they're paying. But if that's the case, I've heard the same thing about the joke out there that Mick Jagger and did the same thing to Rolling Stones, but yep, they're living in their 80s.
Well, yeah, but Brian didn't. He died at 27.
This is true. Brian was 27 when he died, wasn't he?
He had just been kicked out of the Rolling Stones.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a whole
Case in
thing
point,
going on there. So he's a founding member of the Rolling Stones. They kick him out. He ends up dying. He didn't drown in that swimming pool because of asthma. I mean, that's silly.
And don't forget who was with him.
Yeah.
Who was?
Suki.
Well, there was a
48.
story. It was.
And you know what, Ann? I know we had information on that.
Mhm.
And right now, last night, I was looking for different links and I couldn't find it, but she was there.
But she was there. She was at the dinner party with Brian Jones, and she was also in the car accident with Tara Brown.
And she ended up dying in a car accident another 10 years later. After that, driving, her husband and her drove off a cliff.
How old was Tara Brown when he was killed? Was he
21,
21?
20. He was young. And that was approximately 6 weeks after Paul's death, what we think is his death. I mean, there's that couple months window, but we have a pretty good timeline of Paul being Paul into the end of September.
Right.
It's October where he's really not
Gone.
seen. Well, he's not gone, but he's not seen. So there's no evidence that he isn't gone.
Yeah, the only thing I have found so far is a quote from John Lennon. He did an interview October 7th when he was doing his movie, How I Won the War, where he said he couldn't wait to get back to London to work with Paul again. So
He wouldn't have said
as of October 7th, Paul was still around.
Okay.
So
yeah.
Yes, I was always under the impression that it was sometime towards the middle or end of September that Paul was killed.
That's what they'd like you to believe because they want to keep up with the numbers. They have to use those numbers if they're using them as the occult way.
Okay.
So 9/11, 11/9.
Right.
There's different ways of looking at that drum kit.
I don't put too much stock into, well, I don't want to disparage other people on this, but there's a famous book out there that I read.
Yeah.
Dealing with it, and I'm sure you all know what I'm talking about. At this point in time, I consider it rubbish.
Yeah.
I mean, it's been audited. They name dates for this and that, and it comes and passes, and they put a new chapter in the book and re-release it and do it. It's happened so many times.
Yeah. We can talk about that off camera, but yeah, I feel the same way.
I don't take it seriously anymore. And that's my personal opinion. And anybody that does is that, that's fine. Go down that rabbit hole if you want to. But I don't take it seriously anymore. I mean, I remember when it first came out, I mean, that was the book everybody was talking about and everybody was all excited about. But as the years have gone on, I was too. It's like, oh. But, as the years go on and you do your own research and you start to see, maybe this isn't so true.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a clever marketing ploy, isn't it? To sort of say, the Billy's come to us and I'm encoding what he's told me, and it's all fiction, and that's the get out clause, isn't it? But
and I think there's some misspelling.
Yeah, it's really
things where,
and they're very defensive about that book as well. I found, people seem, they get quite upset, if you question certain things.
Oh yes. Well, and there's people on that side that just get really upset. So.
I've been kicked off a website or two for questioning that book.
Me too. You're in good company.
Well, welcome to the shadow of the basement.
Yeah, exactly.
So, yeah.
But
So-
yeah, I mean, rather than going down that rabbit hole, like you said, I mean, what you've talked about in your books, with the pornography and the child sex stuff going on in London in the late 60s and the Cray brothers and all that stuff. Yeah. Even though you present it as fiction, in my mind, again, I won't know what's fact and what's not until I read the nonfiction book when it comes out. But the plausibility of that happening was a whole lot more realistic in my mind than some, like Roy said, here comes Billy on a big golden spaceship down here, and pop, poof, here I am, Paul McCartney, and I can do everything he can do, sound just like him, and out of nowhere, there was
manipulation there for him anyway. That
Right.
they just didn't go out. And I have to laugh every time I see one of those YouTubes where they say, oh, they went out and they got they had a contest, a lookalike contest. Well, what would that do? You look like, there's lots of people look like him. That's why they were doubles or whatever, for detracting the crowds or something, but that doesn't make them play.
I mean, there's pictures out there on the internet right now of during the Help movie of the Beatles with their doubles that were on the set of the Help movie with them to keep, and they look pretty close if you're at a quick glance, but
they're good. Well, those doubles were used for the skiing and everything, so nobody got hurt, and that's what they do in films.
But I don't buy the stuff out there where that they were interchangeable parts. The stuff going out there that the Beatles were like the Monkees. They were a manufactured band. They weren't real. And there were interchangeable parts coming in and out. And you might have Paul one on the Melody Maker show, and then totally different guy playing Paul next week at this concert. Yeah, come on. I mean, that's incredulous in my opinion. And
Right.
Yeah,
stuff they didn't write their own music and stuff out. I mean, these guys were geniuses. And
Go ahead, Roy.
Yes.
well, I was just going to say, one could be forgiven for thinking that the purpose of the books is actually to kind of discredit the argument, to kind of give true information. And if you give false information in the right way, you kind of blow the whole thing away. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
You blow the credibility of.
Well, and isn't that sort of what that group is doing, as far as playing what they said, and now coming out with they couldn't have done this, they couldn't have done that aspect? Yeah.
Yeah. The one thing I don't know.
I don't want to get too much, because I don't want to say too much on air.
Yeah.
But
Right.
yeah.
Did
I
any of
think
you
it was one way of leading people in, and you suck them in, and now you're flipping the switch.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a
making it
possibility.
all-
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank God for Billy,
Yes, Victor.
Did any of you see the interview? And I stumbled upon it accidentally, just surfing the web. That the real Paul McCartney, I want to say it was late '65 or maybe the beginning of '66, right before they went on the American tour, where they asked him how he felt about the fame the Beatles had. And much to my surprise, he actually said, and you would think you would be George Harrison, everybody saying this, that if he knew what the fame was, he's not sure if he would have went down this road. And that, I found that shocking, because out of all four of them, I would always assume that Paul would have been the one enjoying the fandom and the attention, because he was the front man, more than any of them. For him to sit there and say that, yeah, I do have some regrets for this. It isn't what it's all cracked up to be. Then after listening to what we were talking about today, you know what? 2 + 2 just hit 4 with me, because what was he referring to? Could it be because he knew what was going on behind the scenes? And you know what? If I'd have known that, this isn't worth it. I would have stayed playing little gigs in the cavern and been happy for the rest of my life.
Yeah.
There
John
was some
Lennon said that
really,
also.
sorry,
Right.
I was just going to say, there's a really interesting video from a guy an English guy who was a rugby player who won the X Factor in the UK a couple of years ago, I think. And so he put a video out. His name is Levi Davis. And if you look on YouTube, you can find his video where he's basically telling everybody that, you know, he was going into the music business and he was getting to know, it sounds like a producer, possibly somebody in the music business very high up that he was working with, and they were developing a career for him, I think, you know. And the last time he saw him, he was given drugs, very strange drugs, and he was led into a situation which enabled them to film him doing something which led to them being able to blackmail him.
Right.
So, you know, that kind of relates to going into the music business and then suddenly the shock of realizing perhaps what the power structure
The
is.
entrapment.
Yeah. So that's quite a heavy but interesting video to have a look at. I mean, it's more explicit than what I'm saying. But,
I think you guys refer to that in your book there with Paul being drugged and them trying to set him up and to get control of him.
Right.
I think that was in the first book.
Right.
So yeah.
Yeah.
It was the slipping of the LSD to John and George, you know, as innocent as they make it sound, you know, or was it something like Roy's saying, trying to get control of them and compromise what they, you know, so they can blackmail them to get control.
Yeah.
And that's part of their game. If they can't control you, they'll find ways to discredit you and blackmail you and take you down before they kill you. And we see that pattern going on between at least 65 and 66 with Paul going, you know, happening. They try to set him up, and it was hard to do that because they didn't want to give the Beatles bad publicity because that would hurt their income coming in. So they actually had the upper hand that way. But still, Paul was being laced with LSD. And, you know, the earliest that we have found was December of 65 when Tara Brown's wife laced him at a dinner party that they were having with LSD. And he hated LSD. He raged for like 6 hours. He was out of control and angry and shouting, you know. So he had a very, very bad trip. But that's the first account that we found. And I'm sure that there were other ones going on because, like George said, about 1966, you know, they were being laced with LSD so bad that they ended up taking their own drinks to these dinner parties because they didn't want to, you know.
You didn't know what to drink.
Right.
Who to trust.
So, yeah. But yeah, you know, that's the part of the game that they play. And if you watch some of the celebrities that, you know, break, that's what happens to them. And I bring up the example of Michael Jackson. It seems like from the time that he bought the Beatle catalog, it was a steady, you know, downward spiral for him in his career from that point because, you know, he was accused of child abuse and
he messed with the wrong person.
You piss Billy off at your own peril.
So we kind of bring that up a little bit later on in the books, like book 4. We're into book 5. So, but yeah, we kind of mentioned that and use Michael Jackson, as an example because it seems like from that point when he bought the catalog, it was just kind of like a downward, even though it took decades to do it. And even his death is a mystery. You know.
Yeah, when he did the Pepsi commercial, I think that was the start with his hair catching on fire on stage.
Yeah.
That was the slow progression.
I think that was a warning to him.
Probably.
It's odd. But you know, there's several, you know, careers like that when you look at celebrities and their lifestyles and stuff when they go against the grain.
Wasn't there a recording that we could hear at some point that Michael Jackson made where he was saying that he thought they were gonna kill him?
Oh yeah, wasn't it the last? interview? He was going on tour right before he died, and he said that, didn't he? Yeah,
I
that's
think it
right.
was the last kind of, yeah, exactly at that time.
That's right.
I wonder if it's available
Good luck
somewhere.
finding that again.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I do remember hearing it.
Yeah, I remember that now.
I never heard anything about that. I was never a huge Michael Jackson fan, but I remember when he
So
died.
have you watched the interviews of Billy when he's talking about it? Because he's pretty strange about that, imitating Michael and talking about how that all happened.
No, I haven't seen it, but I've seen other interviews where he's been asked about Michael and he does his fake Michael Jackson voice.
Yeah,
And
that's
yeah, he was making fun of him. So yeah, that's been a common thread for probably since he bought the catalog. It's in the mid '80s, somewhere in there.
Yeah, about 85, 86 in there. Yeah. I remember that. Oh, people were so mad.
I remember it too because I remember it was all over the news that Billy, I should say, was bidding on getting the catalog back, and everybody thought it was a done deal. But again, Yoko Ono played into that. I heard he had to go to her to ask for help, and she turned him down. So I mean, who knows? I mean, the political machinations behind all this. If Billy
Yeah.
passed today, it would probably take decades for the whole truth to come out, if the whole truth ever does come out. You know,
I hope it doesn't take that long.
you and me both. But I mean, I'm not just Roy, not to disparage anybody, but I mean, I'm asking you, specifically being British, how far up to the British government does this cover up go? Because you think they've got to be involved. I mean, your
The
book.
Queen's now dead, so that takes that component out. But
What's
I
that?
mean, the Queen's now gone, so
I mean, does it really go up that high to the royal family? I mean, yeah, I've heard the rumors that they're they're one of the families that run everything, in the world.
the
But-
13 families and stuff that are out there.
So it's very hard to say anything with any concrete, but from my perspective anyway. But without a shadow of a doubt, they're part of this higher echelon, which essentially controls the world and is going to take us into the withdrawal of our freedoms and etc. With the rollout of the New World Order and the huge global warming thing, So I mean, for me, it's part of the whole story. The replacement Paul is a small part of a big story that's been going on for a very, very long time. So I mean, it's pretty clear. I mean, it's very difficult to know exactly all of the details, but it is very strange that there are so many claims about the people at the top being into Satanism and child abuse and things like this, when you've got somebody like Jimmy Savile being asked by Prince Charles to counsel him and Diana when their marriage was on the rocks. So he was obviously an extremely close friend, and he's known now as a child trafficker and a mass paedophile. So, which, we've heard about the Belgian government being involved in this sort of, essentially what's been suggested there was a banker from Belgium who came out and explained that basically they break you as a child through these abuses and you become a non-empathic being, somebody who can just do things that have no empathy at all, a psychopath essentially. And that's what you need to be to perform some of the roles that you have to do if you're fairly high up in banking or in government. I mean, that's how I see it.
Or a rock star.
Yeah, or rock, exactly.
I mean, that's probably what happened. I mean, Billy, my guess is he comes from that type of family. And, learn to play the part.
Yeah.
I think
So-
he was willing to do it at a very young age.
No,
You know, I mean,
it's going on here in the States too. I mean, kids are being indoctrinated from the time they start school to, I mean, you look at this, don't want to go off on a tangent, but kids
Just watch
today,
your words.
there's
You're
not
on
much
YouTube.
empathy out there. What's that?
Yeah,
Just watch your words.
Yeah.
Code
That's
is
one
good.
thing, there's not much empathy in the younger generation, and it's because of what they're
Video
taught.
games.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
look at the violence in the video games, and they're desensitized to death, and there's no and the sense of entitlement that everybody has. You know, they're not taught that you're losed. I'm special. I deserve this just because I'm here. It's again, I agree with Roy. I mean, it all kicks back to the New World Order thing, and it scares the tar out of me is what it does. I mean, I'm terrified for my granddaughter and her future, the way those things are going.
This conflict, or the more fear we'll feel, and the more we know, it almost feeds back on itself, because thought can create. This is part of the process, and so it's a very difficult time. I think a lot of us are feeling immense fear. Who would have thought we would go through a time where people supposedly serving our communities are walking down the road, looking into your house, and if they see more than four people together having a drink, they phone the police and take you away. This is what happened during the lockdowns.
Yeah, Australia was a
It
terrible.
kind of goes back to Egyptian time. The rulers at the top, and they are keeping their position and managing their herd. Essentially,
Well,
and probably come to a point where they think 7 billion is plenty. They have to do something about it, so that's why all these incredible things are
and they're
happening.
doing the same. This is off topic, but they're doing the same thing with the food modifications now. The bio foods that you got to really start. So I've seen a lot of stuff going on right in the last week or so, really revving that up. What they're putting in our foods, I didn't even realize. I saw labels from the UK and from ours, and all this junk that we have in our food versus what's in the UK's food, which is now being turned over, and you're now getting that backlash. So anyway, that's off topic, but it's all part of the same. It's all part of the same manipulation and control.
It's kind of off topic, and yet it's part of it.
Right.
It's a huge picture.
Yeah, I think that's the thing that back when this all started. I mean, this all started back earlier on, or we can go back to Wilson and in the early 1900s. But for us, starting in the 60s with them taking out Paul, then starting to take out all these other people as a result, or as a way of keeping people in line, and then the whole manipulations going forward. It's a lot. People really are going to have a hard time with all this once a lot of these realizations come out.
Absolutely.
Starting with Kennedy and 9/11, and
It's
The list goes on and on.
Mhm. Yeah.
It's incredible.
well, guys, what else do we have to banter around here? Any other questions, Victor? Or
Oh, I have
Roy?
one good one for you. The one that all fans are
He was
after.
keeping it.
Yeah, I was waiting to the end. Do you have I know you were saying earlier a few months ago that you were hoping to get the nonfiction book out by Paul McCartney's birthday. Are you still on schedule for that, or has it been going to take a little longer?
Probably not, just because Anne has a trip she's doing here in a few weeks. And if we want to do some of those YouTube videos and incorporate some other stuff, and then we have to do read-throughs and stuff. So
And
it's
how dare
it's
you have a
definitely
life
it's
outside of
definitely
this
this year.
book?
I don't need to put I was trying to put that date out there because I needed to have that motivation to keep myself on track. But I think we still have some work to do. That's that's only a month and a half away, and that's
why I was asking. It's coming quick, and I'm
it's
counting the
coming up too
days.
quick.
Yeah, but we're hoping now for the end of the summer, maybe in September. Yeah, I've got to go away for a while because my mother passed.
I'm sorry.
So yeah. Oh, thank you. She was 98. So I have family obligations to take care of and kind of wrap things up. But Marianne and I were staying on course otherwise, and
Yeah.
it's a big undertaking, this book. It was bigger than we thought.
And as we've been going through it, and like I said, things that were in there, I'm almost thinking maybe we want to maybe rework some of the back chapters. So I think it'll be something to help. But we have to figure out page wise, do we want to, how big of a book can we do without the binder falling apart?
You can always do 2 volumes.
We thought
Well,
of that.
we thought of that, but then who's people going to want to spend the money on 2 books? I don't know.
Oh, sure. Why not?
I don't know. I would, but
We're very excited about it, though. I think the information is going to be very helpful, and it's going to help people to understand Shadow of the Baseman, the novel, better too.
Yeah,
So,
that's my aunt's reading it right now because I
'cause
I actually
you're telling her
refused to give
she's
her
got
my
to read
copy
it.
of it. I made her buy it,
oh, thank you.
but she's reading it, and the hard time she's having with it because she calls me at least once a week with questions, like I'm the authority on it because I read it before her. But she has a hard time getting her mind around the fact that it's a fiction book with nonfiction in it, so she can't separate the two. In her mind, it's fiction, so the whole thing.
Yeah, see, and in my
know what I
mind, I
mean?
go the other way, and it's like it's fiction, but it's all truth.
Right, and that's the way I
Because there's
went
more
into it
truth in
reading
there
it.
than there is fiction. The fiction comes in the conversations and the characters that we had
Right.
to create to bring out the truth.
Right. The first thing I'm doing is buying her the nonfiction book, and so I told her, I said, I'll buy you the nonfiction book. Read that before you read any more of the other series because it'll answer all your questions hopefully, and you won't have to sit there and
Yeah, but we're
do
not
the
going through the nonfiction book and saying, okay, this part of this book is true and this part is fiction. I mean, that's sort of like when people sit there, and I'm not your aunt, but it's like if you're not sure if something's the truth, then try and look it up and research it.
That's what I told her too. I said,
No,
I
don't
and
expect her to
expand the
do that,
search.
but pardon me?
I told her to expand the search too. Just don't look at Paul McCartney. Look at the peripherals around him because that almost
Right.
tells more of a story and what's going on than doing the dive on Paul itself does.
And we have a lot of peripherals in there that those are all factual stories. That's why we have it all sourced.
So
Yeah.
There's a lot of
When we
sources
talk
and
about-
references in that book.
Yeah, when we talk about Jimmy Savile and what he was doing and what he was into, those stories were watered down from actual documents from testimonies of survivors.
And that's
Oh.
scary right there because I never knew anything too much about him or the Cray brothers or anything until I read your books and started researching them. But if you watered it down, they were real,
They're
let's
bad.
just say, characters.
They're
Yeah,
bad.
and you're talking about the prime minister
Yeah.
at the time, and all these parliament members being part of Jimmy Savile, and possibly some of the royals being part of that.
Mhm.
Well,
take it
Savile
today with
network
Prince Andrew
and upper
being
echelon
involved with
people.
Brian Epstein, supposedly.
Right.
I put the supposedly in there because I don't want to disparage anybody.
No, but Brian's he's out on the list. He made the list in what was it, 2012? The pedophile list?
Yeah, there is a sex offender list.
He was on it? I didn't know that.
Oh yeah, Brian
I thought they
Epstein's on
covered
that
it all
list.
up.
No, there's a website you can go to. It's a sex
System.
offender list for the UK and Ireland. It's a database, and if you type in Ron Cray, it'll come up with everything that he was doing, and Brian Epstein is listed in there as a sex offender. So,
Lots of
One last
people-
question for you.
yeah,
This one, I don't know if you can answer it, if you're willing to answer it, just to tease people for the next book. But do you, in your opinion, and I know what I read in the book and what I've deduced from it, I know what I feel, do you think Brian Epstein actually sold Paul McCartney and the Beatles out?
Yes.
So do I. Okay.
I believe
you
it.
agree with that.
The first indication of that is the fact that Brian had all the gambling debts to the Crays, and he was trying to put his money offshore in the Bahamas. That was all the way back in '65.
Yeah, and then he got caught.
And then he got caught.
And then
So what is it? What is it they all do when they're the sex offender? Like Ann was just saying earlier, you know, they're now they're blackmailing whoever brought up the blackmail.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Because I know from day one, even before the Beatles signed had their first contract with Brian in the, what was that, 61? Paul McCartney was always the one questioning Brian, you know, in his business practices. And so, I mean, I have no problem believing that, you know, something similar to what you guys put out in the book is what went down, and that he found out about it. And, you know,
Everything in the book from that section is probably, it's all true. Brian's taken his money there. The Ted Kennedy meeting with Paul and John on a almost nightly basis while they were there. Them
That
going
came from
back.
Ruth McCartney. That came from his sister Ruth McCartney.
Yeah.
Said that they were meeting with Ted Kennedy down in the Bahamas when they were doing help. She was 5 years old, and yet she said she remembers.
Well, she remembers him because he had just had the accident with Mary Jo Kopechne and was in a neck brace.
No, he was in a plane crash
Plane crash.
in
Okay,
'64.
He was, yeah, she remembered it because he was battered up, had on that. Yeah, I guess that was later.
I mean, that's another clue right there, though, of what happened. As close as
Paul wanted to know about
JPL was with his stepsister and the family. Then after, was it late '67? She never saw him again. How do you go from loving somebody and being an integral part of their lives to not seeing them for the next 50 years?
Yeah.
I mean, you just can't. I mean, in my mind, you can't do it.
And she was a kid. She was a kid at that point. So, I mean, did she just think it? Did she know? Does she know? I don't, you know.
That's a good question, but I would probably say no, being she was 5 years old at the time, little kid. I mean, she may know more now, but at the same time, if she does, she'd be smart to just keep mum about it.
Yeah.
Right.
But that what I was saying there though was with Brian and that was going on in the Bahamas. Then when they come back, then they're getting their MBEs. That was Brian. That was the government telling Brian, you're going to let them get their MBEs. We're going to control them.
And they didn't even know what it was.
No.
Right.
John threw his notice in the trash. He didn't know what it was.
John was never too happy about it, having it anyway. Once he found out about it, from everything I've read, he felt like he was the ultimate sellout for some reason.
And he said that was the worst thing the Beatles ever did. Was
Yes,
get
he
their
did.
MBEs.
And why would it be so? Why would it be so bad once you have it? It's like you have it. It's supposedly no big deal, you know. But
And the only time they
behind
wore
the
their
MBEs?
medals, was on Sgt. Pepper. And they
Which,
swore they would
again,
never wear their medals.
that whole thing never would have happened if Paul McCartney had lived, because there's no way Paul McCartney would have went down that psychedelic path, because I have a hard time believing that Paul McCartney willingly would have smoked marijuana, much less done LSD willingly or anything else that Billy may have ever done.
I think Paul.
He was actively against anything that would affect his creative juices, so to speak.
Except for the pot, because that helped his anxiety. I mean, he had terrible anxiety.
Did he?
So, yeah.
Well, to be fair, I mean, all of them did have anxiety, but hey, if you were a Beatle in that situation that they would, yeah, I would be a nervous wreck myself. I mean, come on.
Yeah.
You know, playing in front of, 50,000 people. No. But yeah, I could understand that. They didn't have anything really back then to help people with anxiety. So smoking pot, okay,
Yeah, chilled him out.
Yeah, just chilled them out. It's okay. But Yeah, yeah. I mean, they all did. John even said that too, that they were all very nervous before they got on stage. It was just terrifying to them because, you know, they were, you know, going on Ed Sullivan when you got 50 million people looking at you, or 70 million people looking at you. That's a little scary.
Yeah, that's another thing right there. Do you guys remember when Paul McCartney went back to the Ed Sullivan Theater and he was absolutely clueless to where things were in 1964? You think a seminal, you know what word I'm trying to say, a seminal moment like that in history would be ingrained in your head. But I mean, he was clueless to what was going on around him. And then when Ringo was sitting there with the interview, you know, Ringo did 90% of the talking because Billy didn't know what was going on because he wasn't there. And I don't know.
They passed that off as they remodeled the studio, but they don't remodel studios to that extent because of space. The audience would still be, you know what I mean? It's like it's not like here in New York City, you can't just shift things around. Anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the Beatles come back from, you know, the Bahamas back to England, and then they had this whole campaign going on for fans to, you know, write into this magazine to promote the Beatles and get them their MBEs. They actually, the fans wanted them to be knighted, but yeah. So, you know, they didn't even know about that going on when they returned to England, that there was this campaign going on to get them their MBEs or get them knighted or something. So
I don't think they would have been happy with either one of them.
No,
ideas,
the main
just
crux
because
of the whole thing is Brian had a gambling debt that was crazy. It was owed to the Krays. The Krays are part of the mob. The mob is tied into the upper echelons because they're doing the pedophile ring.
right.
And now they own Brian.
Yeah.
Come on.
And they were huge drug dealers too.
So
yeah.
And look at What do you say, Mr. London person over there in the corner,
Well,
sitting quietly?
It's been freezing for the last couple of minutes, so I haven't heard very much. It kind of,
sorry.
it goes, and so I'm afraid I'm a bit lost. Sorry.
We were talking about Brian and his gambling debt to the Krays.
Yeah.
And
Well,
how much the Krays were involved in the pedophile rings and in everything and had their, you know. So, I mean, the likely scenario is the Krays had their hands in Paul's death.
Quite possibly, yeah, quite possibly. Who knows? I mean, you know, there are probably many people that can do different things. I mean, they had their own thing going, didn't they? So they could have been involved in it. They were involved at some level, but who knows? But very strange, the whole thing about the Krays. I mean, in the UK, as I grew up, they were kind of almost portrayed as like Robin Hood figures, you know. There were these phrases like, oh, they never hurt their own, you know, they were good boys really, and all of this, you know. So I'm kind of interested in that, you know, the way things are spun to us, you know. They were
well, they were spun
it
that
seems
way probably
they were
because of the people they were associated with, right? Maybe.
Well, if they were dealing with the upper echelons of the government and everything with the pedophile ring, yeah, I mean, of course, why would the very people that are going to them for their services, so to speak, disparage them at the same time?
Yeah, I think it's a deflection technique anyway, generally, isn't it? You know, like with Jimmy Savile, who was like a very well-loved character in this country, you know. And so, I mean, if people are just distracted away from even questioning someone's involvement in something as dark as this, then that's quite a useful thing, I think, you know. But it's just, it's very interesting because they were so obviously really nasty people, you know. Apparently, I mean, it's a web, isn't it, of connections.
It goes to the same thing with Jeffrey Epstein here. Epstein.
It's frozen, or have I just run out?
No, I mean, because it's the same thing. You go down to, you know, little St. John's Island or whatever, and you're in a log flight, you know, and they're shipping in kids, and now they have pictures. It's the same thing. You're in that honey trap.
Yeah, yeah, and the Levi Davis thing is, you know, very interesting. I'll send you a link to that because it's very
that'll be interesting. Put it up in the group.
Yeah, it's a bit.
Please, guys, feel free to post into the group when there's things like that are of interest, because if they're of interest to us, they're of interest to everybody.
Yeah, I'll send it to you. I mean, it's a bit dark and it might be a bit difficult to kind of explain the relevance of it in some way, but
okay.
to everybody in the group, I don't know, but I'll certainly you know. Yeah.
Sounds good. Well, we've actually been on here for quite a bit, a lot longer than I thought we were going to be.
Funny how your chats go that way.
Yeah, it is. It is. I don't know if Charlie Freak ever gets to watch our videos. I mean, I know he has our books, and I sit there in the one video when we went 3 hours, I gave Charlie a shout out because I was like, oh my gosh, we're getting up here where we're going to be rivaling his time. But I see a lot of people have been going over longer based on topics too. So that's all right. People can stop and start and continue on. Don't have to watch us all in one bite.
Yeah. But we do appreciate you guys coming on, though. I mean, it's
no,
been
thank
wonderful.
you. I appreciate it. It's had a good time.
We'll have to do it again.
Yeah.
Yes, I appreciate that. And it was nice to meet both of you. Roy and I chat frequently. Just so everybody, Roy is doing a special project with us, so we've been having conversations on that.
And it's going to be awesome.
And it's going to be awesome.
Mm-hmm.
We shall see.
No pressure. No pressure, Roy.
Okay. Well, I'm a performer anyway, so you know.
Yeah, Roy's going to be our voice for the books. So
for the audiobooks.
For the audiobooks. We've had a lot. I from day one, I've had some of my friends. They don't read. They listen. They're in their cars. They don't have the time to do reading, and they've been wanting an Audible, and I know nothing about that. And thank goodness we have a person here who has sound equipment and the right voice. So
we'll give it a go.
your go is going to be good. It's going to be
Absolutely.
fun. I'm excited about it.
Yeah, it's very interesting. It's very interesting from my
Could be a whole
perspective
nother
to
new
do
career
this,
for you.
know. To approach things from different ways is quite an interesting thing for me to do. It sounds a bit of a strange thing to say. I can't explain it much further, but it takes you into things. It's a bit like what John says in the foreword, you know, his playing Paul in the film I Am the Walrus, you know, or The Walrus. Pardon.
The Walrus.
It's kind of gave him a further intuition or connection to it, you know. So
Yeah.
So I'm quite pleased to do it. I hope it goes well.
Well, I hope you immerse yourself into that whole knowledge, and it's just.
Well, I will.
It'll flow out. It'll be good. I'm excited. I'm excited for us, you know, and for our audience and everything, for them to have that other avenue, but also for you, because it's a new venture and into that world that, you know.
It's a really interesting thing to do because you have to develop an understanding of your intimacy with the listener, you know. So it will be my take on how to present an Audible, really.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the way I'm approaching it. I'm not really observing how to do an Audible. I'm just kind of going to do
your thing. Do you, as
you
them.
know, to try and get the most I don't know, the most yeah. Sorry, I'm
That's
waffling.
fine. That's all right.
No, you're fine.
Right.
You're fine.
You're fine. Well, guys, we really appreciate you being here. And Anne, it was nice seeing you.
It was great. It was great. Thanks, guys, for coming. We'll have to do this again. Have you guys?
Right.
Nice to meet you.
Yeah, it's really
Thank
fun.
you.
And if everybody's stuck with us all this time, please make sure you like, subscribe, and share the videos. Go back and rewatch things, and I'll post some links down in the video below when it pops up.
Alrighty. You
All
guys
right.
all have a good day and a good night there to Roy in London.
Yeah.
Yeah,
to you.
exactly. Cheers.